morning, everyone. Welcome to Boardroom Bites at 9. Our topic for today is Decoding the Boardroom, and our speaker for this morning is Joy Marie Lawrence. Joy Marie is an accredited coach, and she holds the Chartered Director of South Africa designation. She runs a niche coaching and consulting firm called Boardvisory, and which is aimed at helping directors and executives achieving successful decision making. And Joy Marie is going to be talking around some great pointers today around culture and decoding that boardroom dynamic. So Joy Marie, I look forward to your session, and very excited to have one of our first female speakers for our month of August, celebrating women this month. So happy Women's Day as well for all the ladies that are on today. Joy Marie, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you very much. That's warm welcome, Vikeshni. Thank you so much. And welcome everyone. It's great on this first session for the Women's Month in August to be with you. The topic that we're going to be focused on today is decoding the boardroom. And it's really about talking about board culture and the impact that board culture has on board performance. So there's a theme, interesting enough, for Women's Month, and that is around be the generation that makes an impact on gender inequality. And I thought it also quite interesting that gender inequality also comes into one of the aspects around board culture. So we covered in that as well. So what do I mean by decoding the boardroom? It's interesting that decoding itself is a skill that we teach, to children and to ourselves around how we learn to read. There's decoding in IT when we talk about converting the code into plain text. And there's even decoding in communication when we talk about the process of receiving and interpreting and then understanding an encoded message. If I say to you concepts like risk, succession planning, financial reporting, they are generally quite well defined and understood. But if I give you the concept board culture, why does it seem less clearly defined and understood? Now, in my years of experience in the board, both as a non-executive director and as a chair of boards, I've also experienced different kinds of board culture through my time in the boardroom. But what's the relevance of decoding the boardroom? So a board culture is less clearly defined, but one aspect of it for me is that it's reflective of the unwritten rules, those cognitive biases that directors have and that the board as a whole also reflects. It's those subtle and hidden assumptions, those beliefs and thought patterns that influence how boards and board directors come to making decisions. Let me explain what I mean. A father and son are in a horrible car crash, and the son is rushed to hospital. And just before he goes into the theater, the surgeon looks at the boy and says, "I can't operate on this boy. It's my son." Now, for a few moments, observe to yourself, who do you think the surgeon is? For some people, they were a bit stumped, like who possibly could the surgeon be? For others, they thought the surgeon could be the child's mother. And for others, it could be the son's second gay father. You see, in decoding the boardroom, the particular board culture we need to observe and notice. I remember an occasion when I was sitting in the boardroom and we were presented with a policy around work flexibility, where management had wanted to explore whether some staff could work from home and have some flexible working hours arrangements. And the majority of the board members at the time felt that if work happened when people were in the office, if you gave people that flexibility, work productivity would be impacted, and it wasn't, as far as certain board members were concerned, in the best interest of the company. So those board members felt that no, work happened when people were in a formal office. Ironically, if you think about COVID-19 and a decision like that came before the board, you would have a very different performance and a different output. And that raises the issue for me that the impact that the board has on the decision making of the organization, that culture impacts the reputation of the organization, it impacts the shareholders' value of what they see they're getting from that particular board. I'll give you another example. If we think about Dieselgate, when Volkswagen, the infamous diesel engine which they developed internally, but its technology failed to meet emission standards. Rather than fix the issue, VW just covered it up, the problem, by installing software designed to beat the emissions test. So what was happening to the board culture at that time? I'm going to explore 4 aspects in the presentation today. I will cover why is board culture relevant? What is the relevance of decoding the board culture? Some tips for boards of directors, and then also some tips for the directors of boards. But before we begin, let's launch our first poll. So in this poll, I'm inviting you to indicate what board experience do you have? Are you ready and waiting for a board appointment? Do you have less than 4 years board experience? Do you have more than 4 years experience? Or are you here to learn and observe? I invite you to participate on the poll. And we'll be sharing the results shortly. Polls are a useful tool for me to interact with the audience because it's quite different when you're sitting in a webinar and you don't have anyone in front of you. So this is a great way to get some feedback. Please also feel free to use the Q&A box and I'll get around to some of the questions perhaps at the end or during the session as we go along. I'm going to end the poll. Yep. So far it looks that like more than 4 years experience, 43% of the participants have more than 4 years experience, but closely some participants with less than 4 years and others who are here to learn and observe. So I'm going to share the results with you. Great. That gives me a sense of the kinds of participants who are with us today. And again, in terms of the feedback and pitching the kinds of examples about decoding the boardroom. So let us continue. So why is board culture relevant? Disruption is the new norm. We see the coronavirus pandemic exposing our inadequate and even broken economic and social systems in South Africa. We also notice and see the Black Lives Matter, the gender-based violence, femicide. These are issues that are happening right on our doorstep and in the world right now. We see the shifts that are happening in the way we see and view each other and the way the world is viewing us and how we view the world. We see the political landscape in South Africa shifting, also globally and nationally. So the question that remains for me is that the boardroom is not immune from what's happening in the world. Organizations have the capacity to shift and impact the world, even more so than governments at times, I would say, because the boards can set the strategic direction for social, environmental, and economic benefit. And the board culture influences how boards set that strategic direction. So why is board culture even relevant? Well, certainly we are seeing that stakeholders are scrutinizing the board's performance. Look at what happened with Volkswagen and the diesel emissions. Stakeholders are wanting to understand what are boards' perspectives, views, decisions around emissions and other impacts into the environment. Stakeholders are also questioning how boards are managing stakeholders. What about technology governance? What about security as well? COVID-19 has been a huge disruption to how boards are making decisions. my experience in the last couple of months, certainly with COVID, is that there have been more frequent board meetings using Zoom and other Microsoft Teams and other technology in terms of how boards are staying in touch. Sorry, our companies are staying in touch with their boards, and the boards are having to make decisions quite quickly and frequently in some cases around certain impacts to the business. But then also we are going to be scrutinized as board members because there is a fine line between strategic oversight and operational involvement. Secondly, boards are becoming more diverse, and studies have shown that diverse boards perform well, much better. And the reasons are varied. Certainly, diverse boards have the ability to be curious. They can explore new approaches and new perspectives. And they can relate to different stakeholders in a different way. So, in the COVID-19 environment in which we find ourselves at the moment, what's highlighted are those boards that don't necessarily have the right skills or the diverse skills needed to navigate during some of these challenging times that are impacting business. If the boards don't have more than 3 females sitting on the board, or if the board doesn't have someone who's under 45 years old, those are the kinds of boards where diversity is making a difference in their approach and how they're doing business. But do all boards understand the board's purpose? And for this, I've brought up a picture that I took during the Neisner droughts. And the question that I would invite all of you to look at is, what is the focus of your attention? Some might notice the water or the rocks, the landscape, the blurriness in front. Or is that a boat? Or is it a transportation device? Or is it a business asset? So too, when in the boardroom, what are we noticing? What are we observing? What is the focus of our attention? And to illustrate this, I'm using the picture of the iceberg. Because we see the top of the iceberg, but we don't see what's underneath. We see a board, but do we understand what the board culture is? What's underneath the surface there? The cognitive biases that show up in the boardroom. Let me give you another example. A board pack. Understand that there's information management happening when they present you with a board pack. There's information that's presented in the board pack because the management is asking for a particular decision. But understand, observe what information is not included in the board pack, what information from stakeholders perhaps of different stakeholders is not included, or what information is included. So I'm saying be aware of what is being presented to you. Similarly, board culture is different from an organizational culture in my experience because of the nature of boards. The board members meet infrequently, about 4 times a year. In some boards, those board members and the board directors are constantly changing and they're shifting. So for even the board to establish its culture takes time, but also you need to notice the different board members, who the chair is, the role of the CEO, in how that particular board culture is being formed. And boards should, and boards do, determine the strategic direction of the organization. But the board must also take the responsibility for establishing a healthy culture as itself as a board, but that is also reflective of a healthy culture in the organization as well. And for those of you that remember Peter Drucker and his famous quote, that culture eats strategy for breakfast, that's a useful reminder that what we might see as a great strategy actually means nothing if the culture in the organization does not support that as well. Again, the board might believe that it has a good and healthy board culture, but what we're seeing underneath the reality is that it's actually not a healthy board culture. So how do we go about sort of decoding and understanding what are those unwritten rules that are happening in the boardroom? Well, the first thing I would say is look at the board directors. If you're sitting in the boardroom, notice the language used by board directors. Those cognitive biases, the hidden assumptions, some limiting beliefs, and their value system, please excuse me, will come out in the conversations in the boardroom. And I don't have to give you many examples, but think of the hierarchical languages, the us and the them, the assumptions about different roles, the perspectives about people who are different or have different experiences. So you'll be able to pick that up when you're noticing some of the individual board directors in how they communicate in the boardroom. Notice the leadership of the chair. Are they autocratic? Do they allow for discussions and debates? Or is the chair someone who just says, here's a decision and let's go ahead with it without inviting different perspectives, an autocratic leadership style? But also notice the leadership style of the CEO. What is the CEO's relationship like in the boardroom with the chairperson? Is the CEO open to being for questioning, for discussions, for debate, or they're not very transparent and being held accountable for their decisions? And then also notice the quality of the boardroom conversations happening. Be aware of groupthink and how the board makes decisions. As a board chair, when you're having a discussion and you need to come to a decision about whether you're approving something, and often I make sure that that all the different board directors sitting in the room have been able to express a view on whether they agree or disagree, or they're asking questions for clarification. But be aware if someone says, no, I agree, and the next person says, I agree, I agree, I agree, and all of a sudden you have groupthink around agreeing on a decision. Rather ask them, why do you agree with this particular decision? And are you able to provide reasons why you in particular are agreeing with this particular reason? Directors have a fiduciary responsibility. So you need to be able to defend and to be able to explain why you agreed or disagreed with a particular decision as well. So notice the quality of the boardroom conversations. And this is where trust also comes. You need to be able to trust your board that they are making the right decisions. All right, so it's time for our second poll. And this one is about, what do you think are the most serious issues impacting the boardroom? And let's just, okay, what do you think is the most serious issues impacting board culture today? And your options are lack of diverse skills to deal with the challenges facing boards. Boards have functional competency, but immature leadership competency. And then there are shifting social paradigms or stakeholder inclusivity. So this is really some of the issues impacting board culture today, and what we think and how we think we need to deal with it. So certainly from the participants who are here with us, and the voting's coming in furiously. We're just over halfway there. Right now, lack of diverse skills to deal with the challenges facing the boards is leaping forward. I'm just looking at some of the questions while we do that. All right, I see there's a few more votes coming in. I'm going to end the poll. Thank you. Thank you for participating, and I'm going to share the results. So the majority of you of the view that the most serious issue impacting board culture today is the lack of diverse skills to deal with the challenges facing boards. And then a close second, boards have the functional competency, but have immature leadership competency as well. So thank you for that. So let's shift to understanding, okay, how do we deal with tips for the boards of directors? So this is particularly for boards. And you know how in school, they teach you the lesson and then they give you the exam? Well, in the boardroom, you experience the exam and then you reflect on the lesson you learn. So 3 tips for the boards. First of all, be curious. Be curious about the board's current style. Now, by that I mean, notice for yourself, is the board inquisitive? Are they curious about some of the decisions that they've been asked to make? Or are they decisive? Or are they collaborative? And there are other kinds of styles as well. I'm just mentioning some of them. And yes, different times in a board cycle requires different types of cultures and leadership styles. I think just of COVID right now and that's impact on the decision-making styles of boards. But notice even during the COVID interruption and disruption that's happening as well, what's the board's style? Again, as a chair, one of the questions I would ask after we've had a discussion is, what question have we not asked as a board? Because your board might have diverse skills and diverse thinking, and they're also coming from different perspectives, and management has provided their research or insights and position on the matter. But sometimes we need to stop and ask ourselves the question, what question have we not asked? Consider, if you want to also explore what is the board's current style, you could consider the board evaluation tools that a number of different companies offer. Even the Institute of Directors is to offer and explore a board evaluation, and a very specific one, because you can evaluate how the board's performing in terms of their committees and each of the directors. But you could also ask questions around unpacking what is the board's culture and what is their style of engagement on issues. The second one I would say as a tip for boards is, does the board model the behavior required? And for this, I'm saying the board might say, think of the iceberg again, oh, we have an inclusive stakeholder approach. But the board's culture is one that's not inclusive of stakeholders as well. There's no evidence that they are listening to other stakeholders. Or the board says, we approve a diversity policy. But actually, if you look at the board, there's no diversity happening at the board level. I think if you look at that picture that I have shown there as well, is reflective of this. And then also looking at the board, if the board's modeling the behavior, have a look at the board chair. Is the chair reflective of the behavior of the board culture needed? And if not, revisit your board succession planning. And then thirdly, does the board culture align with the organization's strategy, the business environment, and importantly, does it support an ethical and effective working relationship with management? So this is where the separation of roles is critical. The board sets the strategic direction and management in the organization is focused on the implementation of that strategy throughout the organization as well. So the question here is, does that board culture align with that strategy and the business environment in which it finds itself in? And to look at that, you need to understand the board's ethical leadership as a whole. Again, thinking of the acronym CRAFT. Are they competent? Are the board directors responsible, accountable? Is there fairness, transparency, and integrity as well? So those are some of the tips for the boardroom. And then before we go into our last poll, this is around tips for the for board directors. I'm going to bring up our poll. It's called Boardroom Superpowers. Which superpower would you like to have in the boardroom? So, which superpower would you like to have? Would you like the ability to read minds, to be able to ask curious questions, the capacity to listen and hold multiple perspectives, to be self-aware, or I already have a superpower? Okay. And to be reminded that there are lots of different superpowers out there, so let's explore. Okay, I'm going to close the, oh, there's still voting coming in quite furiously, giving some people some more time. Right now, overwhelmingly, the capacity to listen and hold multiple perspectives. So let's end the poll and I'll show you and share the results. So the superpower most people, our participants today, would like is to have the capacity to listen and hold multiple perspectives. And I find that quite an interesting one and a powerful one because we are faced with so many different perspectives. So the capacity to be able to hold and listen to multiple perspectives is quite important. Mind reading, interesting, came in as second. The ability to read minds, wouldn't that be incredible? Asking curious questions, asking powerful questions. Again, strong third place as well. And then there were just a few of you who have a superpower, so well done to you. And then self-awareness was the other option as well. Thank you. So now let's turn to individual board directors. What are some of the tips for directors of boards? Well, the first one that I thought of here is self-awareness, the ability to reflect on your own behavior. And why is that important? Well, it's interesting if I say to you, what's integrity? People say, oh, I can point out someone who's got integrity, and I can tell you somebody who doesn't have integrity. And so is the awareness of self. When we don't spend time noticing and being aware of one's own behaviors, we need to notice how we can shift and understand those behaviors, because some of them are hidden, unconscious, and we need to bring that to the front. We need to become aware of those cognitive biases, our subconscious limiting beliefs about and our values. So that is about understanding your own behavior, how you're showing up in the boardroom, how your narrative, your language, how you're engaging with your fellow board members as well. In fact, I would even push the boundaries, if I may, and say that directors in particular need to practice director shift, not directorship. In other words, what is the shift that you can make personally, but also in the boardroom that impacts meaningfully in the decision making in the boardroom as well? So when we notice, when we self-observe, we become aware. And when you become aware, you have choices. The second tip I would leave for directors of boards is to consider holding each other accountable. At the heart of the boardroom is trust, integrity, and the quality of the relationships between the board directors. I've been in board meetings when it's clear that some of the board directors have not read their board packs. And that for me is an irritation, but let me explain. We need to hold one another accountable. Why? If you consider that board members are meeting maybe once a quarter and perhaps in between for subcommittee meetings as well, if a board member has not come prepared to that board meeting and read their board pack and thought about some questions or done some further research or looked at some input that can help contribute to the discussion in the boardroom, it impacts on the robustness of the discussion in the boardroom. Second of all, if the board member then says, oh, I want to know, I have a question, and that answer is on page 26, subparagraph 4, we're wasting some time in pointing that out instead of asking, given the suggestion by management, what is the impact, or I'm curious how this impacts something else in the business. So the types and the quality of those questions are impacted by board members not reading their board packs and coming meaningfully to contribute in the board. Third reason as well is if you're meeting once a quarter and the board member says, no, management needs to go back and get further information and we need further reports, we are impacting and delaying decision-making for another 3 months, which impacts the organization's operations and their decision-making as well. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes we do need to delay some decisions and management needs to get further input, or if the board feels they need other information. But if all the information is there and the board's ready to make a decision, but you can see that some board members have not read the board pack and are not as ready or equipped, and they're just delaying it, hold those board members accountable. Similarly, ask a board member, no, I disagree, or I agree with this decision. Okay, what are your reasons for agreeing? And that's where we can learn and grow and hold other perspectives when we understand and hold each other accountable. Again, build trust with board directors. If a director says, I don't believe that women should be in mining or women should have certain roles, let's unpack that. Let's explore what those perspectives are, what those values, and is that reflective of the entire board, or is that just one perspective, and what are the other perspectives that we could come and bring into the discussion around that. Thirdly, consider coaching, consider mentoring. And there's a difference between coaching and mentoring. With a coach, as a director, you're the expert in your life. When you work with a coach, you work with a coach in exploring, unpacking, testing some of your assumptions, unpacking perhaps a cognitive bias, exploring a mental block or a limiting belief. So it's really around a particular area that you want to build or strengthen or unpack for yourself. With mentoring, for new, for even seasoned board members as well, find someone who can mentor you. And mentoring is about learning from someone who's had more experience. Now, the more experience could be somebody who has many more years of board experience, but also could be a younger person who has more experience in cybersecurity or in social media, and you can learn from that perspective, from that person as well. So mentoring is about, how do I perhaps engage or deal with this particular situation, and the mentor is sharing what they've perhaps done or what's happened for them in that particular context. Whereas coaching, you are working out your own tools and techniques of how you will deal with a particular matter as well. So boards also can be coached as a board, because it's about understanding what the board's purpose is and ensuring that the board members are aligned to that. Coaching can also help unpack what that board culture is and understand what is the culture that you want to have that is consistent with the values, with the vision, with the organization, and in alignment with that. And that's how coaching can help boards to navigate that space. So decoding is a skill. Decoding the boardroom and board culture starts with each one of us. Board culture is important, not just because it's under scrutiny, but board culture impacts board performance. Board culture impacts the organization. So like the picture of the boat on the lagoon, what is the focus of the board's attention? What are you observing and not observing? So I invite you to reflect on your own biases. What do you bring to the boardroom? Observe the unwritten rules in the boardroom and be courageous in having a curious conversation with the board. Be that director that shifts the board culture and practice director shift. Thank you. Vicky, we can go to questions. Sorry. Sure, there are lots and lots of questions coming through. If anybody wants to offer, I'm overwhelmed with lovely, great questions. So let's start here. How do you maintain a board team spirit cohesion in times of a COVID-induced separation? Really, that's from Shepherd. Thank you very much. It's not impossible, but it is challenging. So one of the things to do is, you know, when you go to a board meeting and people before the board meeting stand around and have a cup of coffee and they, you know, you do the chit chat and how's the family and what was the sport this weekend. You don't need to lose that with Zoom calls. So what I would suggest is schedule in a few minutes before your board meeting, or schedule some time during a board meeting or at the end of the board meeting to exactly have that. Open up, do a check-in. How's everybody? Where's everybody at? I sometimes start my meetings with a check-in with what's the one thing you would share or you've noticed about yourself during COVID that you'll do differently beyond this. So create opportunities for people and board members to connect with each other. How does the board culture influence organization culture or vice versa? That's from Godfrey Takiso. Thank you very much. Board culture definitely influences organizations. So I spoke about the difference between a board culture and an organization culture. Excuse me. The board culture might be, oh, we value diversity and we want to ensure that at least there's gender diversity, there's race diversity, but yet the board does not reflect that. It's a board that has no gender, a board that has no race diversity. So that's when they're inconsistent in their application. So the board needs to be called out, and that's where the scrutiny of board culture happens. But if the board culture is one where from the top, the chairperson, the board is living the values of gender and race diversity, then you can see that rolling out through the organization, the CEO, the management team, and the policies of the organization to reflect that shift as well. I think the questions from Henk, what we're interested in, what techniques or tools to suggest can be used to assess board culture. Absolutely, you can use the board evaluation as a tool to do that. I would even say have a conversation with the board. You could take a topic that's coming up for decision and ask yourselves the question, what perspectives have we not heard about this particular matter? Or be curious about understanding what would be the impact if, and then work through different scenarios from that perspective. So those are some of the techniques or tools to go through that. If directors come and go, who ultimately influences and shapes the culture of the board? Good, it's an interesting question. In some boards, directors don't come and go. You have some directors who've been there for 9, 10, a good number of years. And their particular culture and the way they are doing things is not ingrained, but they've developed a way of doing things. In fact, 2 weeks ago, there was another Boardroom Bites, and the Institute has done some research around how do board members or how do non-executive directors have access to board positions. And just one of the aspects that came out of it, not all of them, was that there's that old boys club thinking mentality that people want to bring in people who are similar or they think similar or have a similar background. So just be aware of those kinds of biases that come into board culture. But how do you shift that? So even if a person's been there for 8, 10 years, maybe they might have a particular bias, but it doesn't mean that that bias can't shift. So it's something that between the board chair, and the board directors, even the company secretary, is continually evaluate those different cognitive biases, explore what your culture is, and make it a living activity as well. I see there's a hand raised, Vicky. Should we try?
Yes, I can do that. So if you can please unmute your mic and you can then ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Paco.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this presentation. I would like to comment on that issue of directors depending on their skills rather than leadership, saying it causes conflict because director skills should be blended and then be used to the benefit of the organization, rather than, for instance, the board member with a financial background is going to fight the director for finance because he wants to show that he has that knowledge. So I believe leadership is very important because they will all blend their skills and then generate facilities to facilitate the operations to carry out the work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paco. I think, yes, the more diverse questions that the board is able to contribute to the discussion, and that it's not just the finance person asking the finance question. In fact, if a board member has a strong HR background, that should not preclude them in any way asking a finance related question. So they might not ask what is the return on investment of this particular, but they might be able to ask a question which links the human impact about that financial decision. And that's why having diverse board members helps create more robust discussions and then decision making as well, because you're able to see it from different perspectives in the boardroom as such. In terms of, here's another question I'm going to ask here. Rafiwe Satubi, thank you. In terms of building trust with other board members, is there such a thing as too much trust, especially considering non-executive versus executive board members? So I think trust is critical in the boardroom. You need to be able to trust your board members. But I think the question around, is there too much trust, is you need to, as board members and as the board, evaluate that each time in terms of exploring what do we trust in here. Because as non-executive directors, yes, you need to trust the information that the executive directors are bringing to the board. But you also need to be able to ask questions that satisfy you that all the different angles and perspectives have been covered. So it's not an implicit trust that whatever the executive directors bring to the board, you can trust implicitly. You still need to be courageous, hold them accountable, be transparent, and ask questions about that as well. Thank you. Another question. I sometimes have frustration with boards that appear purely ornamental. For example, a board that is presented with a strategic plan draft, and when it comes to the board meeting, the directors may ask questions, but the meeting concludes without any specific resolution. It seems to just be a conversation. How does one drive effectiveness in a board? That's from Melissa Mazingi. Great question. Part of that answer, my immediate response is your board chair needs to manage that board discussion very carefully. In fact, when you put in the board packs together, it needs to be clear what decisions are for board approval and what are for noting, and be clear about what those decisions are, and then carve out sufficient time to be able to get to a point where you can either approve that decision. If you're having a conversation that's not bringing it back into a final decision, that's a combination of the board chair, in my view, not managing that board in coming to a conclusion. Even if the conclusion is we need more information, but you need to round off and make sure that you conclude on that particular matter. Interesting one. How do I, as a deputy chair, make the chair aware of her autocratic ways? And that's a great question. And part of one of the things I've said for board directors is the self-awareness, because sometimes we don't realize that we are autocratic or that we have a particular view about certain people, because it's so deeply within our subconscious. And autocratic chairs sometimes operate in that way. They're sometimes doing it because they think that's the way to manage the board and they're chairing the process, or sometimes they're doing it from their own lack of self-awareness about doing it. So how do you bring that up? Part of it is also considering asking the curious question, Chair, could we consider this? Or taking it offline with the deputy, particularly if you're the deputy chair, is to be able to have a one-on-one conversation with the chair to say, in this particular, but make it about yourself, I felt that we should have discussed this in more detail. So just explore, bringing it, reflecting it from your experience. I felt this in my interaction with you as the chair. The other way that people unfortunately also do is to use the board evaluation tools as a way of getting from the other board directors perspectives of each person's leadership style in the boardroom. So that would be another way to interact with the chair about their particular autocratic style. Sure, so many lovely questions here. So referring to your example, this is for Nahamo Zondo, referring to your example of a director coming to a board meeting unprepared, how would you hold that director accountable? Can you give me an example, bearing in mind that board members are joint and severally liable for the decisions taken? So there are a number of different ways in which I would hold that board director accountable. Again, depending on the level of the board culture, if it's one of, we can openly say to other, oh, come on, Mr. Zondo, you haven't read that board pack. It could be done collegially like that. If I'm the board chair, absolutely, I would have a one-on-one conversation with you after the meeting about, preparedness for the board meeting, and that that wasn't being addressed appropriately because you weren't prepared for the board meeting. I think board directors need to understand that it's a serious role in being a board director. There are serious implications for a director personally, but also the impact to the organization in decisions not being approved, in decisions not being reached. If a director is not able to bring their part to the table, and even if the director does that once, because sometimes maybe they didn't get to the whole board pack, but if that's a consistent pattern of behavior, then I would not only have a serious conversation with the board member, and you would invite them to think about, well, what else is happening that you're not able to give your full attention and time to this particular governing body or this board, and invite them to reflect for themselves that maybe this board is not where they need to be at the moment because other work is keeping them busy and occupied. There are no other, oh, I see there's another hand up, Vikeshni. Shall we take a live question?
Yes, let's do that. Kuno, if you can please unmute your mic now.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to ask, so from, I saw the few of us who are just learning and some are ready to go into the boards. So obviously one issue that I've seen is people come in there, they have no clue how things are done, and they've got so many questions to ask just to catch up and to find out how things are going. What's your advice? And I've seen that sometimes becoming like disturbance to other board members who are well versed with what's going on. They wish that, you know, these questions should be taken offline. What is the best way to prepare yourself that by the time you are in there, you are not like in a classroom wanting to catch up and learning everything from background? Is there any catch-up sessions or things that you can read, or is there, or everybody has got some background info that they issue to new members? How does it work?
Thank you, Kuno. My suggestion for that would be, first of all, ensure that the board takes you through what we call induction. and an induction process. And that can vary from sitting and meeting with the board chair to get an understanding of how the board operates, meeting with the board secretary, having a look through the past board's couple of certainly annual reports and integrated reports, have a look at maybe 2 or 3 minutes of board meetings prior. But there should be a good induction process where they induct the new board member, and if it's more than one, a couple of you, into the business, meeting with the CEO as well to understand what the nature of the business. So that would be one aspect, absolutely, to engage and have an induction, and that's quite important. The second is, if you feel when you're reading the board pack and you have some questions about it, is you could address some of the questions to the board chair, say, on this particular matter, I have the following questions. How, it might be answered in the session or it might not, or is there some other background on this? The board chair might say, give you a response, or might say, please engage with a particular executive director to get some further information, but do that with the board chair's awareness of that. The other I would suggest is to consider getting a mentor as well to help mentor you as a board director as well. Now, the mentor might just say, when dealing with this particular situation, be aware of this, notice that, explore this, ask these kinds of questions. So that's when mentoring can also help you to understand how to engage with the board pack, with the content in front of you as well. There may be many other suggestions, and others might have some suggestions too, but thank you, Kuno. I see there's a live question from John Murphy. There are lots more questions in the box. Will I look at that?
John, if you can unmute your mic.
Yeah, thank you, Joy Marie, for this morning's presentation. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, the question I just wanted to hear your views on was, what do you believe is the single most important thing for the lead independent non-exec director to do for that individual's own success as an individual board member, and also for the collective success of the board?
So you want one particular thing?
Yeah, your view as to what the single most important thing is.
I think for the lead is playing a particular role because you've come in as a lead director. And so I'd almost think that moral compass, and I'm using that very carefully here, of making sure that both the chair, the non-execs and the execs are functioning cohesively as a board or as a team, and that you're able to notice and observe what some of the unwritten dynamics are happening and call that out. That's what I would suggest as a lead.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Here's from an anonymous attendee. From a gender perspective, when women are minority, how do you advise that they avoid the temptation to fit in instead of maintaining their unique qualities? Great question. It's interesting because I've also been one of those females who's been the only female on a board. I also sit on a board which is only made up of females as well. So I've kind of been in different of those contexts. I think part of answering the questions of how does a woman as a minority maintain their unique qualities is driven by self. How grounded, how comfortable, how self-aware are you of yourself? And some of that can be worked through coaching and also through mentoring as well. I think for me, it would always be about remain who you are. If you try and fit into a particular place, that place is temporal, it's going to move on, and then you're going to have to fit into somewhere else. But understand also that maintaining who you are does mean sometimes being context dependent. So in other words, when you walk into a boardroom, it's about okay, what's the look and the flow happening here? So not being, so just about understanding that context, but remaining true to who you are. And the other question is always going to be a challenge, is to keep asking, I'm curious, why aren't there more females around the table? I'm curious, why is there no more diversity around the table? And even if they say, well, no one's resigned and there are no board positions available, then the question becomes, well, I'd like to understand the board succession planning. How else are we bringing people with diverse skills? It could be cybersecurity skills, all the way to skills around HR or something completely different. But again, look at them saying, what is the succession planning for the board and how is that happening throughout the organization as well? So and again, it's also, I would say, perhaps when I was much younger, I responded very differently to now that I'm a little older. And that also has a difference in terms of how we fit in and how we feel that we need to, because people want to have a sense of belonging. But if you know yourself, that belonging and how you fit into it can be worked as well. Another question. We've got like 5 more minutes to go. Sure, some lovely long questions here. How does one counter or mitigate individual board members' biases that affect the quality of board decisions? Crystal Marie. So, great question as well. How does one counter or mitigate individual board members' biases? Sometimes I do that through humor, because humor can sometimes be a bit of a leveling field, and by that, and be careful about the humor as well. So the example I gave earlier about the son and the father who are injured and have to go to hospital. When you say that to a group and to a board, observe and notice the people's responses. For some people, they can't work out who that person could be. For others, they can realize it's the mother. For others, they realize actually this could be a gay father. So to mitigate it is to try and bring in at times some of those kinds of opportunities for board members to reflect and to notice their biases. Sometimes we don't know we have a bias until someone points it out to us. Or another way for you to notice about biases is notice if you feel triggered when somebody says something, or if the back of your hair, like people talk about the back of your hair standing up. Those are triggers about something that's a bias and that's happening inside of you. Somebody walks into the boardroom that's covered in tattoos. What's your response? Somebody walks into the session and they come in with children. What's your response? So notice and observe. And then again, I like using the word be curious. Invite board members to be curious about their thought processes around particular decisions they're making as well. So Mark Vella, you've asked the question, do you think the level of director competence affects the culture? Does the level of director competence affect the culture? And if so, how to navigate that? Great question as well. I think the response to that is you could find someone who is 30 years old, relatively young, certainly perhaps inexperienced in terms of board experience, but their self-awareness, their ability to hold multiple perspectives, their awareness of cognitive is far more mature than a board director who spent the last 20 years in the boardroom, but their level of self-competence is very low. So it is a combination, which I say, of understanding both your functional competencies, which is your horizontal, as well as your self-awareness, which is the vertical competency as well. And when the two of those connect, a director, a human being, becomes so much more powerful as such. Vikeshni, I would love to answer so many. There's been over 36, almost 40 questions here. I'd love to continue answering these questions, but I am mindful of time. I'm appreciative of everyone asking questions and dialing in this month of August, Women's Month. Let's be the generation that shifts gender inequality. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joy Marie, for a wonderful session. I can see from the comments that have been posted in a chat group, the attendees and members have enjoyed the session. And yes, there's a whole lot of questions still here. I'll try and have a look at what some of the questions are. I've also tried to answer them via typed response as you were answering, so we will have a look at them. Some of the questions raised, we do have a few guidance notes on some of these things. If you look at the guidance tab on our website, there are some items that deal with some of these items, so go have a look at what we have. And by all means, you're also welcome as a member to email your general queries to advisory@IoDSA, and one of my team members will respond with a link to a paper or information that you may need. So thank you very much, Joy Marie, for a wonderful session once again, and I will see everyone next week, same time.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.